Well, I hope you enjoyed playing with Pavlov's dog, and you also enjoyed the little clip from the TV show from a few years ago called Lost. Some of you may remember that. And in that clip, we see Sawyer in what's called a Skinner box. And it was a type of a conditioning implement invented by B.F. Skinner. And that's what we're going to look at right now. Um, in that, you see that we're past classical conditioning now. Sawyer is not responding unconsciously to the association of two things. Instead, he is very consciously trying to figure out what will give him the best results, what actions, what behaviors he can do that will cause him to get the fish biscuit. And so B.F. Skinner, who is probably the best known of all the behaviorists, came up with the idea of operant conditioning. When he looked at behavior, especially in animals, he did almost all his experiments with rats and pigeons, and he saw that behavior was not just conditioned by things that happened at the same time, like with Pavlov's dogs, but it was also conditioned by things that happened before the behavior. He called those antecedents. That's that ABC at the top of the page you see there. They were antecedents. And then there's behavior, that's B, and then especially the consequences of that behavior. And he formulated two basic principles: that behavior tended to be strengthened, it was more likely to occur, it would happen more often, if the consequences were pleasurable. And the behavior was weakened and sometimes even extinguished if the consequences were unpleasant. And so he invented these little boxes that he put rats or pigeons in. And here's one with the rats, you see here on the left. And what he did is he had a place where you could send down food, and he also had an electric shock grid shocker on the bottom of the cage that generated a mild but unpleasant shock that the rat could not avoid. And he taught the rats to press the bar at certain times, like when they heard a certain sound through the speaker, or they saw a certain light flash, or a combination of lights flash, they would press the lever to get the reward. Or if they didn't press the lever, they would get shocked. Okay. This is a picture of Skinner here, by the way, over here on the right. As you can see, he was not the world's friendliest, most empathetic and kindly person, probably. But he was a brilliant scientist. Okay, so let's look at those consequences, okay? There are basically four types of consequences or results in operant conditioning. And it's called operant conditioning because the rat or the pigeon or Sawyer, the person, operates on their environment in order to get certain results. Okay? So basically you have results that increase behavior, which are called reinforcements, and there's two kinds of those. And then results that decrease behavior, consequences that decrease behavior, and those are called punishments. So let's look at them one at a time. Positive reinforcement, we would normally call that a reward, okay? That is probably the most common type of consequence we think of when we think about conditioning. We do it when we train dogs. You know, the dog does what you want them to do, you give them a little treat. They do it again, you give them a little treat. Pretty soon they do it a lot. Okay? A positive reinforcement is whenever you add something that's pleasurable, that's desirable. You add a stimulus and it's desirable. It's a reward. Okay? You see this a lot in video games. You see the little display that you get when you win the video game or when you win a level or something like that. We see it a lot in real life. Every once in a while, teachers use it when they'll give kids candy if they do certain things. Or praise is a very natural positive reinforcement if the person that is praising you, you believe and you like. We'll get to that. Okay. Money is a reinforcement. It's what we call a secondary reinforcement because it's not a natural reinforcement like candy or praise. Human beings, as far as we know, are born loving sweet things and liking praise. But if you give a one-year-old a dollar bill, they will not particularly value it. It's not reinforcing to them. It becomes a secondary reinforcer as you get older and you learn to value the money, or if you're doing a behaviorist system like a token is one, points in a video game are a secondary reinforcer because you learn what they're good for, what they get you. You learn you could trade them in for other things. Okay, so let's talk about a different kind of reinforcement though, called negative reinforcement. This is very badly titled. I wish B.F. Skinner hadn't called it this because it confuses everybody. But a negative reinforcement, keep in mind, is still a reinforcement. It's something that causes behavior to increase. It's called negative because it's a reinforcement from subtracting something from your environment that was unpleasant. Okay, so we all have learned through negative reinforcement, almost in our sleep, to hit the snooze button on our phone or our alarm clock when the alarm goes off. Okay, now you're not born doing that. You've been conditioned to do that. How have you been conditioned? Because when you hit the snooze button, that annoying noise goes off. It goes away. That's a negative reinforcement. Anytime something you don't like is removed from your environment, it reinforces your behavior, whatever you were doing. Okay, so this is the same thing a teacher will do if they say, well, if everybody gets all their homework in, we won't have to take the quiz on Friday. Okay, that's a negative reinforcement. Okay, now let's look at punishment. Punishment is anything that decreases a behavior. A presentation punishment is when something is added that you don't like. Okay, spanking is an example of presentation punishment. Yelling at people is a presentation punishment. Embarrassing people is a presentation punishment, unfortunately often used in schools. And we'll talk in a little bit about why that's a bad idea. Video games don't have a lot of presentation punishment, and we'll talk about why. But for example, in some video games, when you make a mistake, it makes a blaring, nasty noise, a noise. Okay, that's a very minor presentation punishment. Okay, let's look at removal punishment. That's a very common kind of punishment, both in digital environments and real life. Okay, in real life, a parent will say, "Oh, you didn't do your chores, so you don't get to watch TV tonight." Okay, they're taking away something pleasant, and that makes it a punishment. Okay, a teacher will do exactly the same thing. They'll say, "Oh, you guys are too noisy. You won't get to go out for recess today. You've just been too wild." Okay. Video games, lots of removal punishments. If you play a phone game, for example, when you lose, you very often will lose, you'll lose a life or a heart or something on a phone game or a regular video game. If you're playing a battle game and you let the boss hit you, you lose health points. Those, by the way, are a secondary punishment too, because health points you only learn to value later when you figure out how they're used. Okay. Let's see, a lot of times if you lose money, for example, if you're playing a phone game and you use a hint, you have to use a hint, you have to pay for it. In real life, when you get stopped by the policeman for speeding, what happens? You have to pay a traffic ticket. That's a removal punishment. You lose money. Okay, so but the big thing to remember here is that reinforcements, whether they're positive because you gain something or negative reinforcements because you get rid of something you don't like, are all things that tend to increase behavior. Whereas punishments, whether they're presentation punishments, sometimes also called positive punishments, which makes it even more confusing. But a presentation punishment, when something happens that you don't like, or a removal punishment when you lose something that you would have liked. Those decrease behavior. Okay, however, B.F. Skinner was a bright man, and as he worked more and more with rats and pigeons, he learned that punishment is not really a very good consequence. It's not as useful. For example, when he was working with rats, back in let's go look at that again. Let's look at that Skinner, there it is, that Skinner box. When he was working with the rats, he realized if they got shocked too often, it didn't teach them not to do what they were doing. What happened is they just sort of huddled in the corner and shook, and they couldn't function at all. They didn't learn anything. The same thing happens with people. Okay? So why is punishment? I'm not saying punishment never works, but I'm saying it should be the last resort. And you will notice, by the way, in video games, which are probably the most successful digital learning environments in ever, people don't get punished that often. If you're playing a video game and you lose all the time, you're going to stop playing the video game. If you lose and there's just, you lost, you lost, you lost. The problem with punishment is, first of all, it doesn't teach the desired behavior. And those of you that have dogs, that have trained your dogs, know how that works. In other words, if you want the dog to sit when you say sit, if you say sit and then you punish the dog for not sitting, the dog still doesn't know what you wanted. Okay? We'll talk about how you get to where you want in a minute. It's called shaping. But the same with people. When you punish them all the time, you don't teach them the new desirable behavior. It also focuses attention on the undesirable behavior. And as far as we know, rats and pigeons do not crave attention from their experimenters, but people do crave attention. Attention itself is a reward to people. People would rather, the worst thing you can do to a human being, basically, I mean, aside of really horrible things, but basically socially, the worst thing you can do is ignore somebody. Just pretend they're not there. They would rather be yelled at, have negative attention than no attention at all. And if you don't believe this, try a 2-year-old. Have a 2-year-old when you're on the telephone. Okay, they will do anything to get your attention, even negative attention. So when we use punishment, it focuses attention on those negative behaviors and inadvertently ends up rewarding. And the other problem with punishment is that a lot of times it doesn't work the way you wanted it to. The same with B.F. Skinner and his rats. He found that if he shocked them too often, they just sat in the corner and huddled. They had the classical conditioning against being in the Skinner box and the whole situation. This happens to kids in school all the time. If you've got kids who are bad students, so they're getting bad grades, and getting an F or a D on your paper is a punishment. It might not be what the teacher wanted to have happen. It's not, the teacher might not have intended to punish someone, but it's still, it doesn't matter what you intend. It matters how the person takes it. And so if they get that F, they're just sitting there thinking, oh God, I'm stupid. I can't do anything right. I've failed again. That's a punishment. Okay. Well, a kid who gets too many of those, and especially if they get in trouble and they get punishments from the principal too, and things like that, pretty soon they just hate school. And so the teacher may be giving them that bad grade on the essay, was hoping to teach them to work harder on their essay. But instead what the teacher has done is teach them to hate English. And if it goes on everywhere, teach them to hate school. It's unfortunate it comes out that way, but that's how it comes out. So if you punish too much, you end up with a classical aversion effect. You also end up with cheating, attempts to get around the rules. Again, doesn't happen much with rats and pigeons. That's why Skinner's ideas are really smart, but they're not enough for people. People are more than rats and pigeons. But people will cheat. And you saw this classically with what happened in Atlanta a few years ago with the standardized testing. Teachers and the superintendent and everybody were told that if the test scores didn't go up, they would lose money, they would lose their jobs, people would get fired. And you know what? It was too hard to get the test scores up legitimately. So what they did is they just cheated. They changed the test scores. And that's what happens when you punish people a lot of times. They'll just work around you. Also, it creates a hostile oppositional environment. It creates a kind of an us against them type of thing. It creates fear, resentment, and defiance. And again, defiance is something that rats and pigeons don't do so much, but people do. You push them too far, and they'll turn on you. And also, another thing unique to people, as far as we know, is that you can create a negative self-concept. People require an identity. Again, rats and pigeons, not so much. But people want to be somebody. And so, again, I'm thinking about kids in school, and if you've taught, or even if you just know kids and you worked with kids, you know that, okay, a kid who doesn't think they can be the best student and they don't think they can be the good kid, they will take glory in being the bad kid, the worst kid. You will have kids who brag about the fact that all the teachers hate them. It used to be for a while ago, there was this thing where teachers were told to put um, names on the board of people who misbehaved, and that was very lousy behaviorism for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is that putting their name on the board, there'd always be those couple of kids in the back who would like have a contest to see who could get their name on the board first. You know, I'm the biggest, baddest kid. Okay. Um, Even rewards can backfire on you, especially with people and perhaps with cats. um, Punishments and rewards are in the eye of the beholder. In other words, it doesn't matter if I am doing the conditioning, if I am the conditioner, it doesn't matter what I intended, it doesn't matter what I thought. What matters is the result for the subject, the person or the rat or the pigeon being conditioned. So what seems like a reward to one person might actually be a punishment to another person. Um, Video game, classic. Okay, if if I'm playing a video game with my son and he's loving it, and I'm kind of like, okay, fine, fine, I'll do this. Um, when we die, for him, it's a punishment. For me, it's a reward. Okay, good. We can stop now. We can go do something else. And I actually like video gaming, but I don't like all the games he plays necessarily. Um, so a lot of times it can ricochet on you. You don't know whether you're really punishing or rewarding somebody. Again, rats and pigeons, pretty simple. You got food, reward, electric shock, punishment. Pretty much everybody operates that way, but with people, there's so many other things going on. Um, and even when rewards and punishments work on people, which they very often do, and that's why we're looking at it, they can lead to a loss of autonomy and the ability to self-regulate. And in video games, we don't really care about that, do we? We don't want people to have autonomy in video games. We want them to play our game forever. We want addicted players. We shouldn't, but we do. That's how commercial games succeed. Okay? But again, for learning, for education, we don't want people who are just doing what we tell them because they'll get rewarded, or if they don't do it, they'll get punished. We want eventually people who learn to learn for its own sake, who learn because they want to know. And so if it's always reward and punishment, you see a classic example of this with freshmen at the university. We get a lot of freshmen here at the university who come from homes where they've been pretty strictly controlled. They've had a strict curfew. If they don't make that curfew, they've been punished. They've often been rewarded for being good kids, because we get a lot of good kids here at the university, okay? And some of these freshmen come here and wow, there's nobody here to tell them they have to be home at a certain time. There's no one to tell them to do their homework. There's no one to tell, and they go wild. They end up staying downtown till all hours. The weekend starting on Thursday or Wednesday. And you're familiar with this phenomenon. This is what happens. So reward and punishment are are important and effective, especially if we're unintentionally punishing people and don't realize it. And everybody requires some rewards. I mean, not that many of us would go to work if nobody paid us, right? But there's something you have to be really careful with. And the last reason you have to be careful, by the way, I thought you'd enjoy this cartoon, is that people, and probably cats, don't like to be manipulated. Dogs love to be manipulated. They just want to do what you tell them. But cats, not so much. Here it is. Pavlov's cat, the failure. I don't care how many times you ring that damn bell, you know? And again, you've known, if you're a teacher, you've known those kids. Those kids who, no matter how many times you say, well, if everybody cleans up, they'll get a piece of candy. or how many times, especially, you try to punish them. They'll just look at you, as my son did when he was 6 years old and looked at his first grade teacher straight in the eye from, a much lower height than her and said, "There is nothing you can do to make me do what you want me to do." That was kind of a bad thing for him, but it wasn't good for her either. And she was trying to use classic reward and punishment on him. And we've all known these kids that no matter what you do, if you don't reach them, if they don't start to care about you and care about what you're teaching them, you can't do anything with them. So yeah, people will eventually turn on you. Okay, so, but if you're not supposed to use punishment and you have to use reward kind of sparingly, how can you reward behavior if it isn't happening? If I've got, if I'm trying to get people to do a certain thing and they can't do it, then how can I reward them and how can I use behaviorism? Well, Skinner also came up with a really interesting idea called shaping. And the idea is that you reward successive approximations of the behavior you're looking for. Classic example, again, I'm going to use a school example because it's an easy one. But I could use a business example. Okay, when an employee is first starting out, they cannot necessarily do all the things that you want them to be able to do. So, for example, you've got a salesman. He's not going to walk out there on the floor and sell as many cars or whatever it is as your salesman who's been there for 10 years. Okay? Well, if you're a smart sales manager, you're not going to wait and only reward him when he reaches the level of an experienced salesman, because he's going to get discouraged and quit long before that. So what happens, good sales managers reward people for that. First, they start rewarding people just for making so many calls. Okay? And then they reward them maybe for their very first sale. And then you get more reward as your sales go up. So you shape it gradually. And we do exactly the same thing in good digital learning. Okay, we start with the easy stuff. We start saying, great, you did that, with the stuff that's way easier. If we're smart, like if you're teaching math digitally or something, you start with some problems that you know people can already do. And then they get that little reward for that and it sucks them in. Okay, so I'm going to stop now and let you watch just a great example of shaping in dog training. And you'll see how the trainer in a very short time is able to shape a behavior that they never would have gotten right away.